like scary movies?
Uh-huh.
What's your favorite scary movie?
It's alive! Oh, it's alive! It's alive! It's alive! It's alive!
Hello and welcome to It'sJustAwesome.com's 31 Days of Horror Part 4. We're reviewing a few horror films from each decade, starting with the 1920s, as well as giving you a brief overview of each decade's horror cinema history. Horror films actually began in the late 1800s, and House of the Devil is thought to be the very first horror short. But we're going to begin our overview with the 1920s, which were extremely formative years for the horror genre. The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari, widely considered to be the first full-length horror film, used a German expressionist style to set the creepy mood and atmosphere. Structures were sharp and angular, and the long, twisted shadows were painted directly on the sets. This style can be seen in Nosferatu, an unlicensed adaptation of Bram Stoker's Dracula, which may or may not have featured an actual vampire, and would later directly influence Universal's monster movies of the 1930s, as those German filmmakers came to Hollywood. Actor Lon Chaney has become nearly synonymous with the silent horror genre, mostly due to his undeniably amazing special effects makeup that he would create and apply to himself. In fact, this is how he came to be known as the Man of 1,000 Faces, and his influence on horror films cannot be overstated.
Still recovering from the Great Depression, American audiences in the 1930s were looking for an escape, and horror films obliged them by becoming more and more fantastical, showcasing worlds quite different from the harsh reality of the time. And in fact, they were often not set during the present time at all. And all of this was especially true for Universal's monster movies, and perhaps made them some of the most successful movies of all time. Characters like Dracula, Frankenstein, The Mummy, and The Invisible Man all transcended pop culture to become part of the zeitgeist, and this is arguably due to their cinematic representations in these early horror films. And then with the advent of sound in movies, filmmakers had to adopt new techniques as they transitioned from the silent films of the 1920s. Horror movies in particular changed dramatically. Sound could now be used to terrifying effect, and all the groans, moans, and eerie noises from cinema's early monsters would become as iconic as their makeup and costumes. And this is all not to even mention the actors whose voices became synonymous with their timeless characters. When you think of Dracula, do you hear anyone's voice but that of Bela Lugosi?
I am Dracula.
His accent has become inseparable from the role.
World War II loomed heavy over the 1940s, and audiences just weren't as excited to be frightened in theaters anymore. As a result, the studios began to churn out sequel after sequel to their successful franchises from the 30s, with most simply feeling derivative. Then they started doing crossover films like House of Frankenstein and House of Dracula, where several of their movie monsters were thrown randomly into plots that often made no sense. Things were clearly getting stale. But there were a few original gems like Cat People from 1942, and The Wolfman, which starred Lon Chaney Jr., son of silent film star Lon Chaney. He'd go on to play Wolfman 4 other times, including in Abbott and Costello Meet Frankenstein.
Science fiction really began to merge with horror during the 1950s, and many of the themes present in the decade's frightening films certainly deal with science and technology run amok. Also, the alleged Roswell incident occurred in 1947, giving rise to many alien movies during this time. Films like Invasion of the Body Snatchers, The Thing from Another World, and even Plan 9 from Outer Space, which is horrific for a great many reasons.
You see? You're stupid minds! Stupid!
This fascination with aliens also led to so-called creature features, the stars of which were more often than not just men in shoddy rubber suits. By this point, most horror films had become delegated to B-movie status. Maybe that's why filmmaking gimmicks also started popping up more and more. Director William Castle, one of the leaders of this charge, placed buzzers in random seats in theaters for his movie, The Tingler. These, of course, would shock unwitting moviegoers at climactic moments during the film. Then in 1957, Hammer Films, a British company, released their first in a series of gothic horror, The Curse of Frankenstein, and Horror of Dracula, updating classic characters and franchises, and breathing new life into them in the process. The use of atomic bombs during World War II, and the potential use of them during the Cold War, certainly inspired many new kinds of films. Now, radiation and nuclear fallout could be used for all kinds of interesting developments, whether it was enormous insects, shrinking people, or even giant lizards, as in the original Godzilla movie from 1954. Originally called Gojira in Japan, which is a portmanteau of the Japanese words for gorilla and whale, it did not initially feature Raymond Burr. He was added in later when it was released in the US.
The cheesy gimmicks and the over-the-top creature features of the 1950s had worn thin, and audiences in the 60s were now craving more realistic and shocking approaches to their horror movies. This may have been due to the feeling of perpetual war with conflict in Korea having just ended, only to lead into Vietnam, but whatever the case, films like Psycho, which was loosely inspired by real-life psychopath Ed Gein, and Night of the Living Dead all dealt with violence in a more direct, realistic manner. These movies were all sensationalized to be sure, but they weren't holding back and audiences couldn't get enough. Nothing was taboo anymore, it seemed. In fact, Night of the Living Dead contains one of the most shocking death scenes in all of cinema where a daughter kills her own mother. And that's not even counting the fate of Ben, played by Dwayne Jones, who's unceremoniously shot down by a white rescuer who thinks he's a zombie.
Good shot.
Ben was one of cinema's first leading African-American male characters at a time when racial tension in America was especially high. In fact, Night of the Living Dead was released the same year that Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated, so to have a strong African-American lead and a strong white female lead starring alongside each other makes Night of the Living Dead quite groundbreaking and extremely significant in the annals of history. Most of director George A. Romero's Dead movies would have a subtext to them, but this arguably remains his most important.
Don't look at it.
The 1970s continued the trend of more realism in horror films, but toned down the sensationalism. Many of the decade's scary movies were quite simply lean and mean, with almost a documentary-like feel to them. But this is all with the notable exception of Italy's Giallo films, which really hit their stride during this period. They were usually ridiculously gory, but they had an undeniably unique visual style, including bold color palettes. And while these films, as well as Hitchcock's Psycho in 1960, may have arguably birthed the slasher genre, it's 1978's Halloween that really perfected it, laying out the ground rules which most slasher films have adhered to ever since, for better or worse. Michael Myers wasn't some supernatural creature, at least not until the inferior sequels. He was the kind of villain that could be lurking in your very neighborhood at any given moment, and there was next to nothing you could do to stop him. Halloween is also noteworthy because it was one of the first films to use a Steadicam, which could put you, the audience, directly into the killer's head. Its opening scene remains one of the best shot sequences of all time, and not just in horror movies, but in all of cinema. Director John Carpenter and cinematographer Dean Cundey radically changed the game here. And of course, who can forget the film's iconic music, which Carpenter wrote himself. But supernatural horror movies, especially those with a religious theme, still thrived in the 1970s, and in fact, the decade gave us some of the best examples, including films like The Omen and The Exorcist, which is often called the scariest film ever made. It has certainly stood the test of time, holding up quite well even 40 years after its release. The same is true for Jaws, and although IMDb doesn't classify it as a horror, it feels sacrilegious not to at least mention it. The mechanical shark that Spielberg nicknamed Bruce is as iconic a horror movie villain as they come.
You're gonna need a bigger boat.
Horror films in the 1980s embraced the age of excess by being both extremely over-the-top and a lot of fun. A great deal of this was due to advancements in special effects and makeup, which allowed filmmakers to put things on screen that just weren't possible before. But there was definitely a mischievous streak of humor running through many of these films.
Hi, I'm Chucky. Wanna play?
And nowhere was this more apparent than in A Nightmare on Elm Street and its sequels. Freddy Krueger could somehow simultaneously terrify you and make you laugh out loud as he murdered teenagers in their dreams. The villain was now the star of the show, and the victims were so one-dimensional that audiences were actively rooting for them to die, just to see how gruesome it could get. And the movies usually didn't disappoint. This was also especially true for Jason Voorhees in the Friday the 13th series. The humor even found its way into the zombie and werewolf genres, where films like The Howling and An American Werewolf in London made you laugh despite graphic special effects on screen. In fact, both of these movies are considered to have the best werewolf transformations ever, with many giving the edge to American Werewolf.
Horror films in the 1990s continued in the spirit of fun and excess that had dominated the 80s, but they were beginning to lose their charm. Popular franchises were waning, and audiences had grown tired of all the usual tropes. Even a high-profile Dracula remake was met with mixed reactions. But director Wes Craven helped change the horror genre again by making New Nightmare and Scream.
Ever played Skin the Cat?
Both of these films were self-aware and actively poked fun at the slasher genre, while simultaneously being great examples of it. They deconstructed everything about horror and made it feel fresh again.
Never, ever, ever, under any circumstances say, I'll be right back. Because you won't be back.
I'm getting another beer. You want one?
Yeah, sure.
I'll be right back!
This also applied to the Blair Witch Project with its found footage approach and a marketing campaign that presented it as a snuff film. Meanwhile, Japan was helping to reshape horror as well with films like Audition and Ringu.
In the 1990s, special effects had had a breakthrough with computer-generated imagery, and by the 2000s, these effects were implemented in horror films to great effect. Combined with advancements in sound design, surround sound in particular, and new special makeup techniques, these effects allowed filmmakers to create whatever they could imagine with a believability never seen before. No longer did a director have to cut away from a shot because the practical effect didn't look real enough, as Spielberg had agonizingly done frame by frame on Jaws. Because now they could hold shots and show you all the gory details. And just like in the 80s, these new effects led to extravagance, and eventually, the genre that became known as torture porn was born. Films like Hostel, The Devil's Rejects, and especially the movies in the Saw series truly made audiences experience the pain of the characters. It was brutal and visceral, and each film had to one-up the last. As digital video replaced traditional film, movies became less expensive to make, and this was especially true for independent movies. But while these kinds of filmmakers could match the overall look of a big-budget movie, and even edit it on their home computer, they couldn't quite match the level of realism in their effects, so they had to get creative. As it turns out, this made their movies stand out, and audiences loved them. The Paranormal Activity series is a prime example of this, and inexpensive found footage movies began to dominate the market. You didn't need big-name actors to rule the box office anymore, and companies like Blumhouse Productions have flourished in this micro-budget horror genre.
It's hard to tell what the exact trend will be for horror films in our current decade, as we are only a little more than halfway through it. But it seems to be fueled by waves of nostalgia that began in the late 2000s. Remakes and reboots are now the norm. Even Hammer Films has begun making scary movies again. But more importantly, today's audiences are savvy enough to understand the filmmaking process now, and so they demand and expect more from their horror films. As a result, the films have lost their B-movie status, and even attract the best talent in the business, both in front of the camera and behind it. It's truly an exciting time to be a horror movie fan. Thanks for listening, and happy Halloween from all of us here at It'sJustAwesome.com.